and hand this over to Amy. Thank you and enjoy the session.
So welcome to Building the Plane as We Fly It, Sustainable and Person-Centered Approaches During a Renovation. I'm Amy Allen. I'm the University Archivist at the University of Arkansas. And joining me today is three of my colleagues, also from the University of Arkansas: Emily Ward, the Coordinator of Research Services; Catherine Williams, the Library Annex Facility Specialist; and Katrina Windon, Collections Management and Processing Unit Head. So just to give you a little bit of the big picture, our library began a total renovation in 2019, working in two different phases so that part of the library could be open throughout the renovation. The first phase, the construction took place between 2019 and 2021 and renovated our third and fourth floors, which consisted mainly of study spaces, instruction rooms, an admin suite, and some staff offices. So phase two, the construction began at the end of 2022 and will hopefully wrap up at the end of 2024. And it's renovating the first and second floors, which house special collections, cataloging, user services, library IT, digitization, preservation, and we'll be adding several new spaces such as a cafe, a makerspace, podcast booth, event space, and more. At the same time, the building where our fine arts library is located is also doing a complete renovation, which has had a big impact on our offsite storage. So during this presentation, we're going to be focusing on special collections during the phase two part of the renovation, but just to illustrate that there's a whole lot going on in the library overall, and every single person in the library has been affected by this renovation. So the timeline has been slightly different even for different units within special collections. Manuscripts and University Archives started in summer of 2021 with planning, rehousing, making sure that collections were labeled and barcoded. Then in the spring of 2022, we began packing the print collections and transferring those to our offsite storage facility, which we call Links. So you'll probably be hearing us refer to Links several times throughout this presentation. And then summer of 2022 was really the all hands on deck portion for both books and manuscripts. We hired some extra hourlies, had to get some help from outside of special collections. And then everything had to be out in November of 2022 for demolition to begin in December of that year.
Okay, so the numbers that you're seeing here are just some approximations, some statistics that my colleagues and I kept track of during this project. We wanted to make sure that on our end that we were able to take in all of the materials being housed at Links temporarily at a reasonable rate, and we wanted to make sure that we were accessioning items throughout the year and hopefully not winding up having a big rush toward the end. And some of the numbers that you see here kind of confirm what Amy was talking about on our end. As she mentioned, the main move of items really started in the spring. The beginning of the year, there were some fits and starts. And for us, the work really increased in the summer. So you see July, August, September, that was kind of our peak period. And while November was the deadline to have everything out of Mullins, my colleagues and I kind of mentally set October as an important date to us. And the reason we did that was that we wanted to make sure that we were accessioning materials quickly enough so that we wouldn't have to make a kind of mad dash to the finish. Next slide, please.
So as Amy mentioned, planning began back in 2021. It wasn't so much a project phase as it's been a continual cycle. So it started as a fairly proactive and exploratory process. We had informational interviews with colleagues at other repositories that were either undergoing or planning renovations. We had meetings as a division and as functional units to talk about what services might look like during the renovation, what kind of spaces we ideally wanted, pain points in our current spaces that we wanted to avoid replicating, and everything from major to minor issues. So even though this renovation was following a successful renovation on levels 3 and 4, this new project had a different architectural firm we were working with and much more complexity in terms both of public facing spaces and the technical and mechanical aspects involved. So we weren't able to rely on the planning aspects of that previous project as much as we might have anticipated. So a lot of the early work was trying to anticipate the kind of information that might be useful for architects. And then as our planning progressed, it got both more detailed and reactive as we responded to specific requests from architects, responding to budget concerns, and reacting to new information about the spaces and about timelines for moving. Next slide. So a really key factor for us was trying to seek staff input and feedback on the plans throughout the process. So that began with group discussions about what workspaces might look like, what our collection storage might look like, defining both our ideals and then the minimum that we would need to do our jobs. And then as the project progressed and there were, for instance, small group meetings with the architects, those who represented special collections at each meeting tried to get feedback from other division members ahead of time and then report back afterwards so that there could be a good flow of information. Also trying to make clear what types of information were being asked for at any given time and sort of what feedback it was also too late to provide. To ensure that feedback we were getting was relevant and could be used. As we were planning, it was also important to try to offer choice among projects when that was possible. So some aspects of the renovation preparation were dependent on job responsibilities. Certain people had responsibility for certain collections, for instance. But then we also had a lot of very general tasks like securing materials in flat files or packing archival supplies. And so trying to give people an element of choice, even as a lot of external factors were deciding things for us. There were several complicating factors during our planning phase. One that I've already alluded to is that our response timelines were often driven by the architects, which could mean that there was a quick turnaround for making certain decisions, and that sometimes we didn't have all the information ahead of time we would have liked to make a decision and might only get it during a meeting. And then another significant challenge was the multiple changes in special collections leadership and staffing that we experienced throughout this process. And this was felt in a variety of ways, but particularly in terms of trying to track why certain decisions had been made. We had a shared file folder with a lot of our files, but really the institutional memory of our division suffered throughout this process. Next slide, please. So as we were going through all of these changes, there was an attempt to try to balance flexibility with the firm deadlines that we had to meet. So one way we did this was adjusting individual annual goals to make sure that they reflected the renovation and move related activities that someone would be expected to commit to, but also to acknowledge just general disruptions that might be impacting their work, including things like moving their offices or the noise levels or other things. We also tried to stage and scaffold goals so that they were spread out as much as possible across a couple years rather than all falling in the middle of 2022. And this was both to try to alleviate the burden on links, which, as you saw from Kat's chart, still got a huge influx during that time period. But also so that full-time staff members weren't expected to just do move work 40 hours a week. Throughout this process, there's a lot of uncertainty about deadlines and timelines. So for instance, when we moved out of Mullins, we still didn't have an exact move-in date for Gladstone Ripley. And as of today, we're still not quite sure when in the fall we'll be moving back to Mullins. So trying to make clear that there's flexibility in terms of workspaces and work schedules and deadlines. But also sometimes there are hard deadlines that we have to meet, like the day when all boxes had to be out of the building. And so really emphasizing communication about when there are hard deadlines and when there's flexibility has been important. Next slide.
Okay, so as far as the logistics goes, we had to take a lot of things into consideration. The first and probably the most important one is, where are we going to put all of this stuff? What you see here on this slide are two side-by-side images. The one on the left is an aisle within our warehouse that at the start of this project was almost completely empty. And at the other end, you'll see this was the end of the year when we had completed the transfer. And to give you some context about how large this space is, this aisle that you are looking at has about 33 columns of shelving that you see here. And from floor to the top of the shelving, it's close to 40 feet. The shelves get narrower at the top. So because this space, this particular aisle was basically empty at the start of this project, we identified this space as a good area to put our items that were being housed here temporarily. It was identified as our flexible space, and that we hope will make our jobs easier when we turn these things back around, because we can simply eyeball this space and say, okay, everything from here end to end is likely going to be returned back to Mullins once the renovation is complete. And for those of you who aren't familiar with high density storage facilities, we organize materials by size instead of call number or collection type. And we do this because that's a more efficient use of space. We can house a lot more materials that way than you could in stacks. And the items you see here, particularly on the right side, you'll see some books that are in trays, but you see a lot of white record boxes. What we did as a way to house some of the special collections, more delicate materials like rare books, delicate books like that, we put them in boxes or record boxes rather than the trays that we typically use for monographs. The system that we use to track everything is a software system called KayaSoft. And in KayaSoft language, we told it that these record boxes are actually containers. And so everything within that container is assigned a barcode, and that barcode is attributed to a particular box. That makes it easier for us to locate things and to determine if they are in or out of our facility. When someone makes a request for an item that is here temporarily, what we'll do is, rather than pull the book out of that box, we'll send the entire box up to the library for the researcher. We did that because we felt like that was an easier way for us to send materials that would limit the amount of handling that we do on them. And it would be a somewhat easier way for collections to stay somewhat together. So in the end, when they're being sent back to Mullins, hopefully that will help make it easier for them to reshelf those. So, while we were doing this, we still had to maintain our day-to-day operations. We work with interlibrary loan and our own patrons on campus, as well as special collections. So while we were receiving a delivery van full of boxes every day, we had to still do our regular requests and refiling and all of that. So one way that we made sure that we weren't burning ourselves out too much was we would rotate who was operating our forklift, because after a period of time moving boxes over and over again, runs the risk of getting an overuse injury. So around midday, we would switch out and someone else would take over driving the lift and moving things onto shelves and doing the day-to-day operations. We also had to do a lot of planning for our fine arts library because their building was also going through a renovation during this time. So while we were accessioning materials for special collections, we were also doing accessions for our fine arts library materials. So we had to make that work as well. And, you know, in addition to that, the area where our facility is located, there was a building construction right across from us that was causing road closures. They had large machinery in the way sometimes, and that would slow down our progress because our delivery van literally couldn't get up to our door to unload materials. We also had to adjust our delivery times by about a half hour, sometimes earlier or later, to make it work for our colleagues who drive the delivery vans to us, as well as to Gladson Ripley, to Mullins, and to get the campus mail. So it really required a lot of planning and a lot of collaborating with multiple departments to make sure our day-to-day operations did not suffer after we were taking on this extra work. Next slide, please.
So this particular timeline is meant to be representative of our work to assess and pack the print collections that were stored on site at Mullins. There were other packing activities going on at the same time, such as the shipping, packing and shipping of the manuscript materials. But Amy's going to speak more on that here shortly. So the special collections leadership decided to utilize a sprint model to manage this project. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what sprint project management looks like, it's essentially a product of the tech world and productivity thinking that breaks big projects into smaller, more manageable pieces. So the idea is that it's going to help the team stay more organized and to move more quickly and efficiently. So our project was broken into 3 sprints. The first was the preservation assessment and bagging. The second was packing, and the third was packing of uncatalogued materials. So the preservation assessment and bagging began mid-March and ran through mid-April, and I'm going to explain what that means here in a minute. And then from mid-April until essentially our deadline, which was the day before the Thanksgiving break, we were packing. So during that packing sprint, there were 2 important events to take note of. So first was the Sierra freeze. The libraries were planning to migrate our ILS from Sierra to Alma by the summer of 2022. So in order to ensure that the most complete data was transferred to Alma, we were asked not to make any edits in the Sierra system during this freeze period. So that included moving item locations, setting item statuses, deleting items, editing bibliographic records, and similar activities. So during the freeze, which ran from May 25th to about July 5th, I believe, we tracked those kinds of changes manually and then updated those changes once Alma was back up and running. So the second event was the hiring of renovation assistants and a dedicated project assistant. I'm going to talk more about this in the next slide, but I did think it was important to go ahead and mention that here because it really was a turning point in our packing process. And we were successful with this move and meeting our deadline. We were able to get all people out of the building that needed to be out and all of the materials out by that November deadline. Next slide, please. So we were fortunate to have the ability to hire a dedicated part-time project assistant who has since been hired full-time to help with accessioning and research services. This project assistant was responsible for barcoding and inventorying the packed boxes of the print materials. They accessioned the packed boxes into Kayasoft. That's that system that Kat was talking about earlier. And then they also helped prepare boxes for transport to links. We were also assigned temporary staff from the resident temp agency on campus to help with move-related activities in the libraries. Special collections was allotted 4 of those hourlies for about a 1-month period. So they would work Monday through Friday between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. And they were trained by staff, predominantly staff from the Research Services Unit. And they were assigned jobs such as packing, scanning barcodes, building boxes, moving boxes to the pickup location. And they also helped us with other projects as they arose. So working, of course, with temporary staff does have its challenges, but I personally think that this was a rather successful utilization of that of those temporary workers. And I'd like to highlight that before talking about the challenges. So we were fortunate that our assistants were really good workers. They learned quickly. They were very respectful of the fact that we had a deadline. They also drastically sped up our packing process. And a good example of this is we would receive these weekly updates that would provide the division with information about renovation progress. And very shortly after hiring those hourlies, we learned that nearly 2/3 of one of our largest collections was packed in a week by those hourlies. So without their help, I'm not really sure that we would have met the deadline. So I'm really grateful that we had that resource available to us. Lastly, their work made it possible for the full-time staff to shift some of their attention back to their regular duties. So for the Research Services Unit in particular, we were still open to the public. We were still accommodating research appointments, staffing the reference desk. We were monitoring reference requests over email, and we were also filling scanning requests. So not having to spend every working moment packing was really helpful to both the staff and also the patrons that benefited from us being open during this time. And of course, in terms of challenges, I think this is pretty standard across the board when dealing with any type of temporary workers. Sometimes people wouldn't show up. Sometimes people were late. But it really didn't happen all that frequently, and we only had them for a short time. So I think we were very lucky with that. They did need to be supervised, which meant that they could only work during the hours when someone from the full-time staff was on site. So we likely could have had them working more varied shifts if we had the full-time staff capacity to work hours other than 9 to 4, but that was just not something that we were able to do at that time. And then additionally, we did suffer some supply chain disruptions that at times would bring the work to a standstill. And this was particularly draining because these temporary staff, their one mandate was to pack. So if you don't have boxes, for example, there's not really much that they could be doing. So there was at times some sitting around and waiting for shipments to arrive. Next slide, please. So workflows and training were developed by the Special Collections leadership team in conjunction with the Preservation Unit and the Special Collections Collection Development team. And what was conveyed to me during my training was that these workflows were designed to be efficient with both our time and our human resources. They were meant to address stability of all of the materials that were being packed. And ideally, these workflows would help rather than hinder our move back into Mullins once the renovation was complete. So I think it's also important to note that the result of this made it possible, the result of this workflow rather, it made it possible to continue providing access to these materials even while the renovation was underway. So there has not been any disruption to service in regards to those materials that we had planned to make accessible during this renovation. So elements that contributed to efficiency were training and assigned time-limited packing shifts. The leadership team developed a number of short and to-the-point video tutorials that would show anyone, be they a professional archivist or an hourly temp worker, how to properly handle materials and to pack a box in the way that we wanted them to pack the boxes. Some staff were given one-on-one training with staff that had already completed the training, thereby making them qualified to provide training to others. So it was sort of a pyramid. We also packed in pairs for 1 to 2 hour long assigned shifts. And this was particularly important because it allowed us to chip away at this project throughout the day while not burning out our staff. But it also took into consideration our space in the stacks. Our stacks are part of a compact shelving unit, so many of those units couldn't be expanded at the same time. So for the first sprint, we focused on stabilizing the print materials. So it was a very preservation-focused sprint. Our special collections leadership team, along with the preservation unit, devised some workflows that would address stabilization for materials that just needed a little bit of extra protection before putting them into boxes. The team first went through each range of our print materials and identified items that would need to be stabilized. Some items were ultimately pulled and sent to the preservation unit for more in-depth treatment, but most items were marked on the shelf with a slip of paper to indicate the need for to bag the item before they were packed into a box. So once that had been complete, staff from the research services unit, as well as an instruction faculty member and some of the preservation team, were tasked with working range by range to bag those materials that had been flagged. So to give you an idea of the kinds of materials that we were flagging, and you can kind of, bagging, and you can see an example of what that bagging looked like in this slide here. We were bagging items with moderately worn spines and corners. If they had detached covers or pages, they went into a bag. If there were tears or holes present, or if the pages looked particularly brittle, that kind of stuff ended up in a bag. The intention during the planning phase was to pack and move in a way that would make it easier for us to move back into our renovated spaces. So with that in mind, there was a tier system that was developed, and it was to help us identify materials that would be accessible during the renovation versus those that would not be. But it also helped us to flag collections that had some sort of preservation concern. And this isn't necessarily related to the bagging project. These were more broad preservation concerns to like a particular collection or section of materials. And these were concerns that would need to be addressed before we brought materials back to Mullins. But unfortunately, it wasn't necessarily possible to pack materials in any real order. So following like call number order, for example. And this was largely due to the fact that we learned early on that we needed to start packing based off of size of materials. And this was just to be more efficient with our resources. Additionally, we did come across materials that were missing barcodes, for example. They were missing item records. Sometimes the entire bib record didn't exist. So those materials were set aside, and we addressed those materials after the Sierra freeze had ended. So that was what we worked on during that third sprint. Next slide.
So the manuscript materials also had to be all moved by special collections, faculty, staff, and students. So special collections personnel had to make sure that everything was properly housed so it could be transported back and forth. Everything was labeled, had a barcode, it had an accession record in archive space. We had to change all the location codes in archive space. and accession each box into our offsite storage software, and then moving those materials to a designated space in our library's shipping and receiving area. So the hourlies were, as far as manuscripts, were really only able to help with shifting those boxes, which was still a very big help. And then once the boxes were in shipping and receiving, the shipping and receiving staff would move the boxes from the main library to offsite storage. We were limited in how much we could move a day, times of day when we could move boxes, because once the space in shipping and receiving was full, we had to wait for that to be emptied before we could put more boxes in there again. So as Emily said, there was a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of people working on different projects all at once. And it really was everyone contributing. So, we had manuscript people, sign up for shifts to pack boxes, and we had research services, shifting manuscript boxes. So it really took all of us to get this done. And then besides all of the collection materials, we had a whole lot of non-collection materials that we had to deal with as well. So the reading room had to be moved up to a temporary space on the 3rd floor. And even though we announced well in advance that we were going to be closed for a few days, we still had researchers trying to show up while we're trying to move the reading room. We had to pack and move all of the archival processing supplies, all of the exhibit supplies, and there seemed to be an endless amount of shared desks and bookcases and storage closets that we just had to kind of divvy up and just work on those as we could between other things. And then of course, we had to move all of our personal offices. Some of our staff was moving from the 1st floor to the 3rd floor. Some of our other staff was moving to a different building on the other side of campus. The only thing we hired professional movers for during this process was to move the office furniture, but library staff still had to assemble and shift a lot of that furniture. So these are pictures of my office a couple of weeks after the furniture was moved, when I was still waiting on furniture to be assembled, and trying to find owners and homes for the things that didn't belong to me. So it took several weeks once the offices were moved to get them really usable. So we had to be very flexible during this stage with offering staff different options of, if they wanted to work on site, maybe finding a temporary space for them, or giving them the option to work off site until everyone had a usable office. And now we'll switch to talking about how we've kept services going during this time.
So patron-facing services were adjusted once we moved up to our temporary location, just to ensure that staff could handle the new workload. I've listed some of the more, I think, prominent adjustments on this slide, but they really centered around, those changes really centered around appointments, hours of operation, requesting, and access restrictions. And I really wanted to highlight one of those changes that I think was perhaps the most frustrating for both staff and for patrons. And that was the access restrictions to some of those architectural drawings, maps, and the uncatalogued materials. So it was necessary to impose access restrictions for those materials, specifically those that were traditionally stored in a flat file drawer or cabinet rather. Those cabinets had to be stored in an offsite location, not links. This was our previous offsite location. And the way that we had to store them in that building, it just made it impossible for us to service those materials during the renovation. But also it's really difficult to transport a very large flat file that is in a fairly malleable folder to a completely different building, just using a tiny van and one person doing the work to get it there. So while it wasn't ideal, we did try to figure out ways to sort of alleviate this frustration and address it head on before the renovation started. And we went through and sort of identified materials that were most frequently requested. And we stored those materials we kept one of those flat files in the reading room. So while it certainly wasn't a large portion of the architectural collections that are stored in those flat files traditionally, we did select some of the more popular ones. And this, of course, it's not going to address everyone's need, but I think it was particularly helpful for our student researchers who maybe just needed to do more generalized research on, Faye Jones, for example, who's a fairly prominent Arkansas architect, because they were able to still look at some of those more well-known designs of his. But of course, we for patrons where we couldn't fulfill their request because of that access restriction, we did reassure them that those materials, this is not a permanent restriction, that we are going to be opening access up as soon as we possibly can once the renovation is complete. And for the most part, that answer has satisfied most people. Yes, so next slide, please. So throughout the renovation, we have made efforts to remain flexible and adaptable to our situation. So we've made adjustments to our services since moving up to our temporary location, based on feedback that we've received both from staff and from patrons. So for example, after discussing it with our reading room specialists, we decided that we did have the capacity to increase our scanning limits. And this was in large part due to the fact that we had taken on some student workers as well as some interns over the last semester or two. We also increased the number of boxes that were requestable per day per patron. And this was based on conversations that we had with our offsite storage staff, so links, and then our shipping and receiving staff, to make sure that they were going to be able to handle that increased volume. But this was also largely based on feedback that we had received from patrons, particularly those who were making international trips to do research in our reading room, because it's expensive to travel. And they would need to get through as much material as possible during time with us. So having that increased box limit from 5 to 10 was extremely helpful. Additionally, we did find that 5 days advance notice from U of A affiliates in particular, so that's staff and students, was a bit overkill. So we decided to reduce their advanced notice requirements from 5 days down to 3. But we also needed to address workflows, particularly workflows that we shared with other units on campus and in the library. So many of those units were being displaced as well, and they had lost staff. So it was important to work together to adjust our workflows so that they worked for everyone. It also required us to be flexible and to be able to make changes quickly when some aspect wasn't working for one or both units. And we also attempted to make these workflows sustainable so that they weren't dependent on just one person. Lest that one person became unavailable or the position became vacant, the whole system could come crashing down because of that. So we also took the time to document all of these workflows and made sure that everyone who was involved, as well as our leadership, had access to those documents. I think it's also helpful to be able to see when changes were made so that you can try to understand why those changes were made and if that change is working for everyone. Next slide.
So we did have to do a reduction in recruitment of new collections, both because of limitations for accessioning and storage space. So with all of special collections materials and all of the fine arts library materials currently in offsite storage, that's put a real crunch on our available storage space. So Link's staff had to determine what the available capacity was left, and special collections tracks everything that we're sending over so that we're make sure that we're not exceeding the available capacity. We did put a policy in place to ask donors who wanted to donate collections greater than 10 linear feet if they could delay transfer of those materials to after the renovation, which is great in theory, but hasn't always worked in practice, because we have had to take in collections if someone is, moving to another state, or if a donor has passed away and their family's needing to clean out their home, or the university is giving them a deadline for when they have to be out of their office. So we have still taken in collections when needed, and we've delayed when possible. It's also been a challenge just getting those collections. The building where we're currently located outside of the library is kind of out of the way and difficult to find. And even when we provide written instructions and maps, donors often still go to the wrong place. And then there's the trying to figure out where they are and how to get to them or get them to us. So all of the people who have accessioning and processing as part of their duties are in a building called Gladstone Ripley, which was built as a men's dorm in 1954 and has had very limited updates since then. So you can use your imagination on that. It's definitely not built for library work. We're dealing with temperature and humidity issues because there's no central HVAC. We're basically in dorm rooms, so we're not able to process very large collections. Some of the staff are on the second floor of the building with no elevator, so boxes that we work on in our offices have to be carried up and down a flight of stairs. We also don't currently have room for student workers, and we're used to having anywhere from like 3 to 6 student workers to aid with processing work. In addition to interns and volunteers. So we haven't had that assistance during this time. But we have done our best to continue working on processing projects throughout the renovation. Maybe just instead of working on large collections, we're working on smaller or mid-sized collections during this time.
So as you've probably gathered by this point in the presentation, this has been a large, time-consuming, and often stressful experience that's impacted all library staff to some degree, and special collections and link staff to a significant degree. It's also followed a series of other large projects and disruptive events, including a 2017-2018 move of all materials from an older storage facility to links, a 2018 migration to archive space, implementation of Aeon in 2020, and a number of significant changes related to COVID, temporary shifts of job responsibilities due to staffing turnover, and then the migration of Alma that occurred at the exact same time as these renovation preparations. So staff had been in a near continuous cycle of disruption and change. And even when these were positive changes that we were intentionally pursuing, like the renovation, it was still important for us to acknowledge both the negative impacts and also to advocate for the needs and well-being of staff throughout the process. Next slide. So a significant part of that advocacy revolved around setting realistic expectations. And a key part of that was determining and then communicating both inward to our administration and our colleagues and outward to our patrons and donors about what the capacity constraints were. And Amy and Emily have talked a bit about what that looked like in terms of donations and researchers. And I think something we already knew, but this experience really highlighted, was the degree to which we rely on student workers in processing and accessioning. And so that has been particularly impactful. So even with the reduced services that we established in some areas, we were still adding work on top of the day-to-day work for many people. And so taking into account these challenges of extra duties, of new and temporary workflows, of noise levels, space and environmental limitations, transit time between spaces for those who had duties that might be at both Gladstone Ripley and at Mullins. But there were also more individual impacts, things like changes to how people commuted to campus, where they parked, how their morning coffee routine went, and really acknowledging that it was a huge disruption for everyone, even in ways that might not have been reflected in sort of official announcements on the website. Next slide. A particular challenge was having a dispersed workforce, and especially because this was following a period where we'd had a lot of COVID restrictions, and sort of just as those were easing, then we moved into the renovation. So we continued a lot of virtual meetings. And when we had in-person meetings, we had to continually remind people to build in transit time as people walk across campus. More recently this year, our administration has established some bookable swing spaces at Mullins so that if people have multiple meetings over there in a day, they can book the space to work in between and not have to keep going back and forth. We've also had some alternate transportation options. So in 2022, a couple donors gave the libraries a new golf cart that is primarily for VIP donors, but has also been used to help shuttle staff back and forth for special events sometimes. And then recently, as some different initiatives to sort of counter the lack of everyday interaction or feelings of isolation, we've had some division dinners and get-togethers, and a move towards hybrid division meetings where we still have the virtual option for those who need it due to their workspace or their accessibility needs, but also the in-person option. And so really it's been trying to strike a careful balance between accessibility and convenience throughout this phase. Next slide.
So from the links side of this, my colleagues and I have already begun having conversations about how we think the post-renovation move will go. And as I said earlier in this presentation, the really convenient thing about putting a lot of our temporary items in one particular aisle is that we can look at that specific space and say, okay, everything from here down must go. And we would just slowly work our way down the aisle, returning things back to Mullins. There are, however, some materials that are located in other parts of our warehouse, and we would need to get some more information about what that collection is. Since everything is given a barcode in our warehouse, as long as we have the barcode, we can locate the item. So for the materials that are in aisles 7 and 8, that information will help us take those materials back up. We have to have more conversations with some of the other members of the library as far as deliveries go. So that's a conversation we have to have with our colleagues who make deliveries. We have to talk with them about how frequently they want to have us give them items to move back and the volume of that. So we typically, on a normal day, we will have 3 deliveries between us, 3 a day between us and Mullins. So we'll have to work with our people to see, do you want us to have something sent all 3 of those times, or would you prefer just the first leg of the deliveries or the last one of the day? And how many of these boxes would you like us to have ready for you, and things like that. But we have to keep a few other things in mind. For one, Links is short-staffed. When we started this project, we had 3 full-time staff doing a majority of the legwork on the lift, lift, like what you see on the picture right there is the lift that we've been talking about. Right now, we only have 2, and we don't know when we will get our third person hired. So we have to be mindful of how much we're capable of doing. We also anticipate that we're going to have to move back the books that we accessioned from the Fine Arts Library because we anticipate that the completion date of their renovation will be around the same time as Mullins Library. So we're going to have to figure out how to make both of those projects work. And then again, just there's more specific logistical things we have to keep in mind, how to return these. Do we want to just go down aisle by aisle, or do we want to send things back by collection? Which way would make it more convenient or easier for the special collections people to be able to do what they need to do? Next slide, please.
So for the move back into Mullins, we will need to revisit that tier system that was established at the beginning of the move to decide what materials need to come back and when. We've already begun having very general and broad discussions about how we're going to allocate the space in the on-site storage areas. And to do that, one of our methods of evaluation is going to be to use the use statistics from both Aon and Kayasoft. So when analyzing that data, we'll need to think about which materials need to come back first, maybe based on their frequency of use. But we'll also need to think about the staffing needs around the move, what's going to be required of staff in the moving process, and then also addressing some of those preservation concerns that we had about those items that were flagged using that tiered system. We'll also want to consider when staff are going to come back and what that's going to look like. Are we going to have movers to help with that? Are we going to focus on getting staff back first before we start moving materials back? I would think so. And then also thinking about when and how we are going to resume services in our renovated spaces. So not only will we have a shiny new reading room, but we're also going to have a dedicated classroom. We're going to have a gallery space. And then also our Arkansas Folklife and Traditional Arts division, or I guess it's a unit within Special Collections, is going to be our new neighbor next to the reading room. So we'll need to think about servicing those areas and communicating our grand opening to the public. So we do know at this time that the reading room is not going to be closed at any point during the move back. So we'll need to make sure that we're communicating with our patrons to let them know that where they need to go when they're coming in for their appointments. We'll need to ensure adequate staffing to support and continue reference services, and also begin thinking about adjusting our services back to what their original capacity was pre-renovation. And my final thought on this is that unpacking is definitely going to be a lot of work. Especially when we think about unpacking all of the materials that we're moving back into the building. It's going to require a lot of intentional planning to determine what comes back and how space is going to be allocated. We're going to also really need to be considerate of the amount of physical labor that we're asking our staff to take on to do this kind of work. Not just special collection staff, but also links and our shipping and receiving staff. But I think that one of the, I guess, pros of this part of the renovation is that we're not going to have a deadline like we did to move out. So we don't necessarily need to rush to get these materials back in. We can take our time and make sure that we're doing it right so that we set ourselves up for success for decades to come. Next slide, please.
So just a few final thoughts. If you're going to be going through any kind of process like this, you're going to want to start planning and doing the work as early as possible because it's most likely going to take more time than you're anticipating it will take. There's always going to be surprises, so definitely plan all you can, but just know that things aren't always going to go to plan. And definitely keep in mind that moving is a lot of extra work. It puts a lot of extra physical labor onto your staff, and there's a lot of physical and mental stress that goes along with it. So definitely reduce other tasks if possible, allow extra breaks, allow time to do other tasks, and just be aware of what you're asking people to do. And it's easy for one exception to become a lot of exceptions. So definitely when you can, put policies in place about what limitations you're going to need to have during this time period, and get your leadership to support that. While we were expected to keep things going throughout the whole renovation, we had to be very clear about what the limitations were going to be, and that we couldn't do things to the full capacity of what we normally were doing things. So that is all that we have for you today. So thank you for joining us, and now we can take any questions.
Yeah, so this is Melissa Gonzalez, moderator. It looks like we have a couple of questions here about if y'all considered hiring movers to help with the physical moving process other than the furniture, and along those same lines, if it was a cost-saving measure to have library staff move and put things together instead of working with facilities to do that.
So we did ask about movers, and our administration decided that they were not going to hire movers. We did hire movers when we moved from a few years previous, when we moved from our older offsite storage to our new offsite storage building. And just personally, I will say that was a lot easier on staff and a lot faster. You know, we were able to do it in a matter of months instead of taking a year to do it. As far as the furniture, I don't think our facilities was willing to help with the furniture. So I think our only option was to hire movers for that. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on this.
Okay, if nobody wants to add, I will go to the next question. Do you use any specific software or programs to organize your sprints?
No, I mean, no, we just sort of, I guess just designated activities for specific time periods. And then the tools that we use, I guess, for packing, we did use spreadsheets a lot. We used shared spreadsheets to scan those barcodes, those item barcodes into those spreadsheets. And that was very helpful and kept us organized. There was some other shared documentation that just kind of, I guess, let people know what they were going to be working on and when, but it was not super structured, I guess I should say. I don't know, does anybody else have anything to add? Again, I wasn't really here for the planning part of the sprints, so I was just told that we were doing sprints.
All right, if another panelist is not going to chime in, I will go to the next question. Did you have issues with getting materials out of the storage areas and special collections due to door size, etc.? And did you pallet manuscript boxes, or did you handle the packing of those boxes?
So our flat files were definitely an issue, fitting through doorways. Our architectural records archivist, Kat Wallach, who you'll hear from in other panels at this conference, personally supervised, I think, the moving of every single flat file because that was such a fraught process. But in the advance of that, we had tried to pack out the files with various padding to make sure things moved over okay, which was semi-successful. We didn't end up palletizing anything because the libraries were doing the moving ourselves. So it was our shipping and receiving van doing the moving that wouldn't fit a pallet anyway. So it was typically, I think, in the range of 50 to 100 boxes moving at one time. So we just sent over the existing manuscript collection boxes.
And we do still, when we're moving boxes back and forth from offsite storage to either Lynx or Gladstone Ripley for the smaller, like half linear foot Hollinger boxes, we have large clear tubs that we put those in with some padding so that they're not just moving on their own. The record carton boxes move on their own, and anything smaller goes into a large plastic tub.
Great. It looks like in the chat, Mike Miller is throwing a plug for Iron Mountain's Library and Archival Services Division as a mover for these kinds of projects. If anybody's considering a renovation or a move, he said they moved their archives to temp storage for a shelving project last year, and that Iron Mountain was great to work with. And then some other chats thanking you for sharing your experiences and advocating for each other as you went along. If there are any other questions, I'll hang on for a second, but it doesn't look like there is. Do the panelists have anything else y'all want to add, or? All right, well, I think we can go ahead and close out this session then and give y'all some time before the next one. I will go ahead. Thank you so much for this panel. It was really great and informative. And the recording will be available next week. Oh, there's a raised hand. Charlene, if you could submit a question in the, that may have been by accident. Maybe I think she was trying to clap. I've done that before, so yes. But anyway, thank you. I will end the recording now and have a great rest of the meeting. Thank you, everyone.